58-year-old janitor worked the overnight shift at a hospital for 19 years. The chief of surgery watched him every single morning from the window of her office. She never introduced herself. She never said his name. She didn't know that the floors he mopped at 3 a.m. were the same floors her residents walked on during their first code blues. She didn't know that he kept a photograph in his breast pocket, not of a wife, not of a home, but of a girl in a white coat holding a diploma. She didn't know that the girl in the photograph was the reason he had never called in sick. Not once. Not 19 years. And she didn't know that on the morning she finally learned his name, nothing about the way she ran her hospital would ever be exactly the same. Calvin Drewe had not kept the job at Mercy General by being invisible, though most people treated him that way. He had kept it by being indispensable in the way that only people who do the work no one wants to do can ever be truly indispensable. The floors on the surgical wing gleamed at 6 in the morning because Calvin arrived at 10 the night before and didn't stop until they did. The supply closets on the 3rd floor were organized by category, then by size, then by frequency of use, a system no one had asked him to create and no one had ever acknowledged. The hand sanitizer dispensers on the cardiac floor were never empty. Not once in 19 years had a nurse reached for one and found it hollow. He was 61 now. He had started at 42, the year after the factory closed. Before Mercy General, Calvin had worked 14 years at a manufacturing plant in Dayton, Ohio, that made industrial cable components for freight carriers. He ran the floor inspection line, which meant he walked 8 miles a day checking welds and tension points, a job that required more precision than most people assumed and paid better than most people expected. He owned a house, a used Ford F-150, a savings account with enough in it that he and his wife Sandra had started talking about what a real vacation might look like. Nothing exotic, just somewhere warm, somewhere that wasn't Ohio in February. Then the plant closed on a Thursday with 48 hours notice and the letter that used the word restructuring 4 times in 2 paragraphs. Sandra had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis 2 years before the closure. Mild at first, manageable. But the health insurance that came with Calvin's job at the plant had been covering the medication that kept manageable from becoming something worse. Without it, the medication cost $900 a month. Their savings lasted 8 months. The house lasted 14. The truck went at 16. By the time Calvin was hired at Mercy General, he and Sandra were living in a 2-bedroom apartment in a building that had a broken elevator and a parking lot where people left grocery carts instead of returning them to the store. He took the overnight shift because it paid an additional 75 cents an hour, and because Sandra slept better when he was home during the day. He would come in at 10 p.m., mop the surgical wing, restock the supply closets, clean the procedure rooms, and be home by 6:15 a.m. to make Sandra's coffee before she woke up. Their daughter Imani was 17 when Calvin started at Mercy General. She was studying for the SAT at the kitchen table most mornings when he came home. Textbooks spread out around a bowl of cereal she'd already stopped eating, pencil moving fast, erasing even faster. She wanted to be a doctor. She had wanted to be a doctor since she was 9 years old and watched a television show about emergency medicine and turned to Calvin and said, completely seriously, I think that's what I'm supposed to do. He had believed her immediately. He still did. Imani was accepted to the University of Cincinnati's pre-med program on a partial scholarship. The rest needed to be covered somehow. Calvin worked doubles twice a month, and Sandra, on the days her symptoms were quiet, took in alterations from a dry cleaner 2 blocks away. They didn't tell Imani about the money. They told her the scholarship covered more than it did. They told her to focus on her grades and not to worry about what she couldn't control. She graduated with honors. She applied to medical school. She got in. The photograph Calvin kept in his breast pocket was taken on the day of her white coat ceremony. Imani was 24 in it, standing in front of a banner that said College of Medicine, her white coat still stiff at the shoulders because she hadn't worn it long enough to break it in yet. She was smiling the way people smile when something they've wanted for 15 years finally arrives and they're not sure they believe it yet. Calvin had driven 6 hours each way for that ceremony. He'd asked for the day off 3 weeks in advance. His supervisor had approved it without looking up from the schedule. That was 4 years ago. Imani was a resident now, At a hospital in Atlanta, internal medicine. She called every Sunday at 7 in the morning, Cincinnati time, because Sunday mornings were the only window that reliably fit both their schedules. Calvin mopped floors and answered those calls, and kept the photograph in his pocket and did not think of himself as someone doing anything remarkable. He thought of himself as a man going to work. Dr. Elaine Marcus had not become chief of surgery at Mercy General by being sentimental. She had become chief by being precise, by making decisions quickly and defending them completely, by earning the trust of her board through outcomes rather than charm. She was 53. She had been chief for 7 years. Before that, she had been the kind of surgeon who took the cases other surgeons photographed for medical journals. Not because she was reckless, but because she was thorough in ways that translated into results that made recklessness unnecessary. She arrived at the hospital at 5:30 every morning. Her office was on the 4th floor, corner window, east-facing. Most mornings, if she looked down at the right angle, she could see the walkway between the surgical wing and the parking structure below. Most mornings, at some point between 5:30 and 6, a man in gray custodial clothes crossed that walkway pushing a cart. She had noticed him the way you notice anything that is consistent. The same cart, the same route, the same steady pace that didn't hurry when the weather was cold and didn't slow when the load was heavy. She knew his shift ended at 6 because the cart always disappeared into the maintenance corridor at 6 almost exactly, and then the walkway was empty. She did not know his name. She had never thought to ask. He cleaned the floors below her office, and she worked in the office above them, and that was the entirety of their relationship for longer than she had thought to track. What changed? It was a Tuesday in November, and it had nothing to do with Elaine and everything to do with Imani. Imani Drewe had been at Mercy General for 11 days by then, not as a patient, but as a visiting resident through a case exchange program that sent third-year residents to partner hospitals for 2-week rotations. Calvin had not known she was coming. The program had placed her. She had called him the Sunday before and said, almost laughing, "Dad, I'm going to be at your hospital." He had stood in the kitchen for a moment after she said it, and then sat down at the table. "My hospital," he said. "For 2 weeks," she said. "Isn't that wild?" He had not slept well the night before her first day. Not from worry. From something else. Something closer to the feeling you have when a story you've been carrying for a long time finally comes around to a chapter you didn't write and couldn't have predicted. On the 3rd day of Imani's rotation, a patient on the cardiac floor went into arrhythmia at 4:17 a.m. The attending was in surgery. The second attending was with another critical case on the ICU floor. Imani was the senior resident on call. She ran the code. Calmly, methodically, in the way that people who are genuinely trained for something perform under pressure, not by becoming someone different, but by becoming completely themselves. 22 minutes. The patient stabilized. The attending arrived at minute 23 to a situation that had already been managed. Calvin was mopping the hallway outside the cardiac floor when it happened. He didn't go in. He wasn't supposed to. He stood at the edge of the corridor with his mop handle in both hands and listened to the voices inside without being able to make out words, and at some point during those 22 minutes, he became aware that one of the voices was Imani's. He recognized it the way you recognize something that has been yours. Your whole life without ever being something you chose. Just a fact. Just a sound. His daughter's voice, steady and clear, in the middle of something that mattered. He did not cry. He turned around and finished mopping the hallway. Dr. Elaine Marcus heard about it the next morning from the attending, Dr. Thomas Vega, who mentioned it the way physicians mention things that impress them while trying not to appear overly impressed. The resident running the exchange program handled the Kowalski arrhythmia last night, Thomas said, reviewing charts. Fast, clean, no panic. Which resident? Drewe, Imani Drewe. Elaine noted the name. She had a habit of writing names down when they appeared in context that mattered. A small notation in the corner of whatever she was reading at the time. She wrote Imani Drewe in the margin of a surgical report and moved on with her morning. 2 days later, she passed Imani in the 4th floor corridor. She recognized her from the resident photo roster on the exchange program intake sheet. Young, late 20s, white coat, now broken in at the shoulders, a stethoscope worn the way people wear things they've stopped thinking about because the things have become part of them. She walked like someone who knew where she was going and had already thought through what she'd do when she got there. Elaine stopped. Dr. Drewe. Imani turned. Yes? Good work on the Kowalski case. I heard it went well. Imani nodded once. Thank you. The team was quick to respond. It's your call that I heard about, not the team's. Something moved across Imani's face, not pride. Something quieter than pride. My father always said, the work speaks for itself, she said. I try to let it. Elaine looked at her. Where's your father? Imani smiled. Just slightly. He works here, actually. Elaine waited. He's on the overnight custodial crew. Surgical wing. There was a pause. Not awkward. Just present. Elaine processed what she had just been told and what it meant that she had not known it. What's his name? She asked. Calvin, Imani said. Calvin Drewe. That evening, Elaine looked up the employee records for the overnight custodial staff. She found Calvin Drewe. She read his file. Start date. Department. Shift hours. 19 years, not one absence, not one disciplinary note, not a single formal acknowledgement beyond the standard annual HR review that was the same template used for every employee in the building. She sat with that for a while. The next morning she arrived at 5:15 instead of 5:30. She did not go to her office. She went to the surgical wing. The floors were still wet in sections, which meant the mopping wasn't finished. She followed the trail of damp tile down the east corridor and found Calvin at the far end, near the supply room, loading the last of the used mop heads into a laundry bin. He was moving with the efficiency of someone who had done this exact sequence of actions enough times that the body knew the order without consulting the mind. He heard her footsteps and looked up. She had thought about what she wanted to say on the drive over. She had considered several versions of it. What came out was simpler than any of them. Mr. Drewe, she said. I'm Dr. Marcus. I'm the chief of surgery. Calvin straightened. His expression was polite, careful, the expression of someone accustomed to encounters with authority that require him to be alert without knowing why. Good morning, he said. I met your daughter 2 days ago, Elaine said. She's exceptional. Calvin looked at her. Something shifted in his face that had nothing to do with being caught off guard and everything to do with a particular kind of sentence landing on a person who has been waiting a very long time to hear it from someone whose opinion carries weight he hasn't allowed himself to need. Thank you, he said. His voice was steady. She works hard. I know, Elaine said. I read about the Kowalski case, and I've been watching you cross the parking lot walkway at 6 a.m. for longer than I can honestly calculate. I didn't know your name until yesterday. Calvin nodded slowly. He didn't offer anything to fill the silence. He just waited to see what it meant that she was here. I want to fix that, Elaine said. Not just knowing your name. The rest of it. He looked at her carefully. The rest of it, he repeated. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her coat pocket. She had printed it before leaving her office the night before, after the second time she reread his file. It was a memo, internal. The kind that required her signature to initiate and the board's approval to finalize. We're piloting a support program for essential overnight staff, she said. Benefits review, shift wellness access, tuition support for dependents of long-term employees. She paused. You qualify for the retroactive scholarship component for dependents currently in graduate or professional education. Calvin looked at the paper but didn't take it. Imani has 2 years of residency left, he said. She's not in school anymore. The residency housing supplement is also part of the program, Elaine said. She qualifies. He looked at the paper again. Then at Elaine. Then, without any of the calculation that usually accompanied a decision about whether to trust someone, he took it. He held it the way you hold something you didn't expect and aren't sure yet what to do with, but aren't going to let go of either. This is already approved? He asked. The pilot is approved, she said. Your enrollment isn't yet. That requires a signature from you and a 30-minute meeting with HR. He nodded once. There's one more thing, Elaine said. She reached into her coat pocket again. This time she produced a smaller piece of paper, handwritten on Mercy General letterhead. I've recommended your name to the Patient Environment and Safety Committee. It's a volunteer advisory role, monthly meeting, an hour. They need people who actually know what's happening on the floors. She paused. I mean that literally. The committee has 11 members. None of them work below the 3rd floor. I'm told we've had 3 dispensary access complaints in the past year from nursing staff. I'd like to understand why. Calvin looked at the handwritten note. He looked at her. You want me to tell you what's broken, he said. I want you to tell me what you see, she said. There's a difference. He put both papers into the front pocket of his uniform shirt, over the breast pocket where the photograph was, slightly above it. He said, I can do that. Elaine nodded. She started to leave, then turned back once. Mr. Drewe, have you ever been formally recognized? An employee appreciation event? A department commendation? Anything? He thought about it with the particular honesty of someone who doesn't perform modesty. No, he said. She held his gaze. That's going to change, she said, not as a promise. As a statement of fact, delivered by someone who did not make statements of fact. She couldn't back up. She turned and walked back down the corridor. Behind her, the floor was still gleaming. Here is what most people don't talk about when they talk about essential workers. They don't talk about the invisible infrastructure of care that holds institutions together at their most vulnerable hours, the hours no one photographs, the shifts no one tweets about, the people who make the morning possible for everyone who arrives at 7:30 and assumes the building was always this ready. In the United States, the Bureau of Labor Statistics classifies approximately 3.4 million workers in building and grounds cleaning occupations. Their median annual wage is under $30,000. The average hospital employs between 40 and 200 custodial staff, depending on size. Many of those employees work overnight. Many have been in their positions for a decade or more. Research published in the Journal of Hospital Medicine has found that cleanliness of patient environments is one of the most significant predictors of hospital-acquired infection rates, which account for roughly 1.7 million infections and nearly 100,000 deaths in U.S. hospitals annually. The people most responsible for preventing those numbers from being worse are the people most consistently left out of the conversation about how hospitals function. Calvin Drewe did not know those statistics. He knew which floors needed an extra pass after a busy trauma night. He knew which supply room locks stuck in cold weather. He knew that the hand sanitizer dispenser outside room 42012 had been refilling at twice the normal rate for 6 months, which suggested either higher traffic or a leak in the mechanism. And he had reported it twice to facilities management without response and eventually just started checking it himself every night. That was the kind of knowledge Elaine Marcus had just asked to borrow. The HR meeting took 40 minutes, not 30. Calvin sat across from a woman named Patricia who had worked at Mercy General for 22 years and who handled the paperwork with the focused efficiency of someone who takes bureaucracy seriously enough to make it work for people instead of against them. She explained the pilot program clearly. He asked 2 questions. She answered both directly. He signed where she indicated. When he got home that morning, Sandra was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee and the newspaper she still got in print, because she liked the way it felt in her hands. She looked up when he came in. She could read his face in a way that required no words and hadn't for 31 years of marriage. Something happened, she said. It wasn't a question. He sat down across from her and put the copy of the enrollment confirmation on the table between them. She picked it up. She read it. She put it down. Calvin, she said. I know, he said. She pressed her lips together, swallowed once. Does Imani know? Not yet, I'll call her Sunday. Sandra looked out the kitchen window. It was 6:42 in the morning, just light enough that the parking lot outside was visible, and the oak tree at the corner was coming back from the flat darkness of the pre-dawn into something with dimension and texture. She looked at it for a moment, then she said quietly, 19 years, baby. I know, he said again. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. They stayed like that for a while. 2 people who had spent 19 years holding something heavy between them without putting it down, sitting together in a kitchen where the coffee was still warm and the window was filling up with morning. The Sunday call with Imani was at 7 Cincinnati time. She picked up on the first ring, which she only did when she wasn't in the middle of something and was specifically waiting for him, which she always was on Sundays. "Hey, Dad." "Hey, baby." He told her about Dr. Marcus, about the meeting, about the program. He told her slowly, the way he told her things he wanted her to understand completely, not just quickly. She was quiet for a while after he finished, long enough that he checked the phone to make sure the call was still connected. "Dad," she said finally. "Yeah." "You never told me it was hard," she said. "I didn't want you thinking about money when you were thinking about medicine," he said. Another pause. "I'm going to call you more than Sundays," she said. "You don't have to," he said. "I know I don't have to," she said. "That's not why I'm doing it." He smiled. He didn't say anything because the smile was enough, and she would hear it in the silence the way she always had, even from 400 miles away. The trouble came 6 weeks later, the way trouble in institutions almost always comes. Not loudly, not honestly, through a conversation that was framed as a concern. A man named Vincent Hale was a director of operations at Mercy General. He had been in the role for 11 years. He was thorough in the way that makes some people effective and other people dangerous. Thorough in service of the metrics he trusted, resistant to the ones he didn't. He had sat on the committee that approved the pilot program for overnight staff. He had voted in favor of it because the data on retention and wellness outcomes was sound, and he understood sound data. What he didn't understand or chose not to was the individual case. He brought it up in a department head meeting 3 weeks after Calvin's enrollment confirmation had been processed. He didn't raise it as an attack, he raised it as a question, which is how people raise attacks in institutions with glass walls and recorded minutes. "I want to make sure we're applying the criteria consistently," he said, looking at the table rather than at Elaine. "The Drewe enrollment. The employee has a notable personal connection to a current visiting resident. I want to be sure the committee is comfortable that the selection wasn't influenced by that relationship." The room was quiet, not because the question was unfair. It was framed fairly. It had the shape of due diligence, the language of oversight, the tone of someone who cared about process. But what it actually said underneath all of that was, "Are we sure we didn't do this because she liked the story?" Elaine looked at Vincent across the table. She had known him for 7 years. She knew exactly what was being asked. "Mr. Drewe qualifies on every criterion in the pilot guidelines," she said. "Tenure above 15 years, no disciplinary record, current dependent in qualifying professional education. I can show you the checklist." She paused. "I'd also point out that his name was brought to my attention to the clinical record of a resident whose competence I was already tracking. The connection went the other direction from the one you're implying." Vincent nodded. He didn't push further. But the question had been asked in a room with other people in it, and questions asked in rooms have a way of moving through buildings the way water moves through walls, slowly, invisibly, and in ways that show up somewhere other than where they started. Calvin felt it, not from anything anyone said to him directly. He was not someone people said things to directly. He felt it in the slight shift of a facilities manager who used to nod at him in the parking lot and now walked past without acknowledgement. In the way the new overnight supervisor started conducting inventory checks on Tuesdays, which happened to be the shift right after Calvin's supply room reports were filed. He didn't say anything to Imani on the Sunday call. He didn't want her carrying it. He mentioned it to Sandra, briefly, the way he mentioned things he wasn't sure how to categorize. She listened. She said, "You've done your job for 19 years. Nobody can take that away from you by asking a question in a meeting." He knew she was right. He wasn't sure right was enough. What resolved it had nothing to do with Vincent Hale. It had to do with the supply room on the 3rd floor. Calvin had been logging a recurring pattern in the overnight supply reports for 3 months. A consistent shortfall in sterile wound dressing inventory that didn't match the usage records from nursing stations. Not a large shortfall, 11 to 15 units per week, too small to trigger the automated reorder flags in the inventory system, too regular to be human error, too consistent to be coincidence. He'd reported it twice. Both times it was logged as noted pending review. No review had followed. On a Thursday night in late January, instead of submitting the report to the facilities portal as usual, He wrote it out by hand on a clean sheet of paper. The pattern, the dates, the quantities, the discrepancy between usage records and physical stock, and left it in an envelope addressed to Dr. Tonder, Marcus, on the desk of the 4th floor nursing station, which he knew she passed every morning on her 5:30 walkthrough. She found it at 5:47 a.m. By noon, risk management had pulled the supply chain logs for a 14-week period. By 3 p.m., a vendor billing discrepancy had been identified. A supplier had been invoicing for units delivered to a secondary contract site while logging the inventory as received at Mercy General. The billing irregularity amounted to $42,000 over 4 months. It would not have been found by the automated system. It was too small per unit and too consistent in pattern to trip the flags that the system was designed to catch. It was found because a man who mopped floors at night had been paying attention to something no one had asked him to pay attention to, and had the patience to track it for 3 months before deciding to put it in an envelope. Elaine called Calvin into her office on a Friday morning. The first time he had ever been in it. He sat in the chair across from her desk and looked at the east-facing window and thought that from here you could see the walkway below, and that she had been looking at it for longer than she had known what she was looking at. She told him what they'd found. She told him the amount. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I wasn't certain, that's why I waited." 3 months, she said. "I didn't want to make a claim I couldn't support," he said. "My father always said don't say something unless you can show it." He paused. He was a factory worker. He said it about defect reports. "But I think it applies." Elaine looked at him across the desk. The man who had crossed the walkway below her window for 19 years. The man whose daughter had steadied a patient's heart at 4 a.m. in a cardiac bay down the hall. The man who had been carrying a photograph in his breast pocket since before some of her current residents were in high school. She said, "I'm recommending you for the Institutional Excellence Award. It comes with a formal recognition event and a financial component. And I'm making the advisory committee role permanent, not voluntary." Calvin looked at her. "The supply closets still need to be stocked," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to do something different. I'm asking the institution to see you while you do it." He sat with that for a moment. It was a particular kind of sentence, the kind that doesn't ask anything of you but costs the person saying it something real, because it required them to admit what they hadn't been doing before. "Okay," he said. That was all. Just okay. But it landed the way things land when they've been a long time arriving and the person receiving them has never once asked when they were coming. 2 years after Elaine Marcus walked down the east corridor at 5:15 in the morning, Calvin Drewe sat in the second row of the Mercy General atrium at the annual Institutional Excellence ceremony. He was wearing a suit he hadn't worn since Imani's white coat ceremony. It still fit. Sandra was in the seat beside him, her hand through his arm, her posture straight in the way that people hold themselves when they're trying to make room for more feeling than they know what to do with. Imani was in the seat on his other side. She had flown in from Atlanta. She had not told him she was coming. She had coordinated with Sandra, who had kept it for 3 weeks, with the specific discipline of a woman who understood that some surprises were worth keeping. Calvin had turned when she sat down next to him and had not said anything for 4 full seconds. Then he said, "You're supposed to be in Atlanta." "I was," she said, "and now I'm here." He looked at her. She looked back at him. Neither of them looked away. When Elaine called Calvin's name from the podium, he stood up and walked to the front of the room with the same steady pace he used to cross the walkway at 6 in the morning. Not hurried, not performing, just moving toward the next place he needed to be with the full weight of himself present in each step. She handed him the plaque. She shook his hand. She leaned close enough for the microphone not to pick it up and said, quietly, "Thank you for the envelope." He said, just as quietly, "Thank you for opening it." The room applauded. Calvin looked out at the rows of people, administrators and surgeons and nurses and residents, and the overnight crew members who had come in on their off hours to sit in the 3rd and 4th rows, and found Imani's face in the 2nd row, and she was smiling the way she had smiled in the white coat photograph. The way you smile when something you've believed in for a very long time, turns out to have been worth believing in. In his breast pocket, folded and soft from years of handling, the photograph was still there. The same girl. The same banner. The same stiff white coat that had long since broken in. He didn't need to take it out. He knew exactly what it looked like. He had kept it there every night for 4 years, through every corridor and supply closet and pre-dawn hour that no one had been watching. He had kept it there, not because he needed reminding, but because it kept him company in the dark, and because some things you carry not out of necessity, but out of love. Later, after the ceremony, after the dinner and the conversation and the photographs that Imani took of him and Sandra in front of the atrium windows, after they had walked out together into the cold parking lot and Imani had hugged him for longer than usual and said, "I love you, Dad," with the particular force of someone who means something beyond the words themselves. After Sandra had squeezed his arm in the car and they had driven home in comfortable quiet, later, Calvin sat at the kitchen table with the plaque in front of him and a cup of coffee that had gone cold while he was looking at it. The kitchen was quiet. Sandra had gone to bed. The parking lot outside the window was empty. The oak tree at the corner was bare in the January dark. He thought about the 19 years, not with regret, not with bitterness, not with the particular sourness that comes from having been overlooked and knowing it. He thought about them the way you think about a long road you drove at night. Aware now of the distance, not certain you understood it while you were on it, but clear in retrospect that you had been going somewhere the whole time. He picked up the plaque, read his name on it once, put it back down. Then he pulled out his phone and found Imani's contact and sent her a text. It was after midnight. She was probably asleep. That was fine. She would read it in the morning. He typed, "Your grandmother would have liked today." He set down the phone, drank the rest of the cold coffee, turned off the kitchen light. He was back at work the next night at 10 o'clock. The floors weren't going to mop themselves. The supply closets weren't going to organize themselves. The hand sanitizer dispensers weren't going to check themselves. And somewhere in the building, a resident who had once run a cardiac code at 4 a.m., with their father mopping the hallway outside, had made it possible for him to stand in the front of a room full of people and let them see him. That was the whole story, not the plaque, not the $42,000, not the ceremony or the committee or the program that would eventually place 11 other overnight employees into the same recognition track he had opened. Just a man who showed up every night for 19 years because his daughter needed him to. And a woman who finally walked down the corridor at 5:15 in the morning because she had been looking out a window long enough to understand that what was below it mattered as much as what was above. And the morning after the ceremony at 6 o'clock, the East Walkway and Mercy General was empty for the first time in 19 years, because Calvin Drewe was home, asleep, in the first real sleep he had allowed himself in longer than he could measure, and the floors below Elaine Marcus's window were already clean. I keep thinking about the supply closets. Not the ceremony. Not the plaque. Not the moment Elaine Marcus walked down that corridor at 5:15 in the morning and finally said his name. I keep thinking about the fact that Calvin Drewe organized those supply closets by category, then by size, then by frequency of use. And no one asked him to. No one was grading it. No one was grading it. No one was going to notice if he didn't. He did it anyway. At 11 o'clock at night, in a building full of people who would walk past those closets the next morning without a second thought. That's the part that stays with me. There's something that happens when you do the right thing in a room where no one is watching. Not a reward, not immediately, but a kind of internal compounding. The same way interest builds on a savings account you never touch. Calvin spent 19 years building something invisible, and then, one morning, through a chain of events he couldn't have engineered if he tried, it became visible all at once. His daughter ran a code. A surgeon noticed. A name got written in a margin, and suddenly 19 years of quiet, unwitnessed integrity walked into a room full of people who were finally paying attention. That's not luck. That's cause and effect operating on a timeline longer than most people are willing to hold. What I've come to believe? Slowly, after watching stories like Calvin's play out in enough different rooms in enough different ways, is that character is just behavior repeated until it becomes structure. Calvin wasn't a remarkable man because of one grand gesture. He was remarkable because of 10,000 small decisions made consistently, in the dark, when the only person who would ever know was himself. That's what integrity actually looks like. Not the speech. The supply closet at midnight. And then there's Imani, who became a doctor not despite her father's circumstances, but because of what those circumstances taught her about what a person can carry without putting it down. She didn't learn that in a classroom. She learned it watching a man come home at 6 in the morning, make coffee, and never once say that any of it was hard. There's a kind of intelligence that doesn't come from study. It comes from paying attention to someone who is showing you, every day, how to hold yourself together when everything around you is doing the opposite. The thing that moved me most wasn't Calvin receiving the award. It was the text he sent Imani after midnight, "Your grandmother would have liked today." That sentence carries 3 generations of people who worked hard in rooms where no one was watching and passed something forward without naming it, without making a speech about it, without needing anyone to confirm that it mattered. I think about what would have happened if Calvin had cut corners. If he'd skipped the 3rd pass on the cardiac floor on a slow Tuesday, if he'd stopped tracking that inventory discrepancy after the first report went unanswered, the $42,000 would still be missing. The vendor would still be billing for inventory that never arrived, and a man who had given 19 years of his best work would have given the institution no reason to see him. But he didn't cut corners, because that's not who he was, and who you are in the small moments is exactly who you'll be when the moment that matters finally arrives. That's the whole lesson, not the ceremony. The closet.